The sky above Pine Ridge Valley boiled with storm clouds, dark as wet slate, as if the mountains themselves were bracing for a fight. On the ground below, a single gravel road wound through 8 gleaming mansions like a silver snake, ending at an old log cabin perched on a rise. That cabin was about to become the center of the biggest HOA scandal in Colorado history. In the next few minutes, you'll discover how a seemingly harmless homeowners association turned into a multi-million-dollar trap, and how one man's quiet return home set off a chain of events no one saw coming. Before we dive in, if you love true-to-life property dramas where ordinary people take on impossible odds, tap subscribe and turn on the bell. That way you won't miss the next wild story from our channel. After 3 years away, the valley smelled different. The crisp, pine-scented air Declan Forrester had once inhaled like medicine now carried traces of fertilizer, diesel, and expensive perfume. He had left this place as a caretaker of family history. He was coming back as a stranger to his own land. His boots crunched over gravel his great-grandfather had spread by hand in 1923. Each step up the mountain road was a step back into a legacy of hard labor, frayed knuckles, and stubborn independence. But the view no longer belonged to him alone. Where wildflower meadows once spread in chaotic beauty, manicured lawns rolled out like green carpet squares. 8 glass and steel mansions rose from the valley floor, architectural trophies imported from a suburban dreamscape. Their reflective windows caught the gray light and threw it back cold and sterile, erasing the warmth of the land beneath. At the end of the road stood the old cabin. Its cedar logs had weathered to a dignified silver gray, a sentinel of the mountain's history. Inside, dust sheets cloaked the furniture, and a single photograph of Declan's mother smiled from the mantel, her face a reminder of the sacrifices that had kept this place in the family for nearly a century. Declan had spent the last few years on oil rigs across the Dakotas, sending every paycheck to her memory care facility. He had returned to bury her and, he thought, to heal. Instead, a new sign blocked his way: Private Community, Pine Ridge Estates. Access restricted. HOA enforcement active. Steel chains wrapped across the driveway like a challenge, padlocked with fresh hardware. The cabin he had inherited sat behind a barrier he hadn't erected, guarded by rules he had never agreed to. Declan parked his rusted truck at the roadside and scanned the valley. A white Range Rover idled near the sign, exhaust curling into the cold air. The vehicle's gleaming paint contrasted sharply with the mud-spattered fenders of his own truck, a symbol of two worlds colliding. Inside the Range Rover, a woman with a platinum blonde bob scribbled notes on a clipboard. Her expression, sharp and appraising, matched the angles of the mansions she presided over. What Declan didn't yet know was that this woman, Vivian Ashworth, had spent the past 2 years turning Pine Ridge into her private kingdom. Through a shell company, she had purchased parcels of land around the valley, fast-tracked permits with the help of friendly county officials, and crowned herself president of the newly formed Homeowners Association. Her rules governed everything from roof colors to mailbox styles, and she enforced them with the precision of a corporate audit. The cabin's cedar shingles, aged by decades of mountain storms, violated her approved color palette. The hand-built root cellar, which had once stored potatoes during the Great Depression, now counted as an unauthorized outbuilding. Even the wildflowers that had grown here since before statehood were non-compliant landscaping. Each violation carried a fine. Each fine added pressure. Her ultimate goal was simple: make the last holdout sell. As he walked the perimeter of the chain driveway, Declan spotted fresh tire tracks, evidence of recent visitors. The air felt charged, like the moments before a thunderclap. He had been gone only 3 years, but the transformation was complete. His family's sanctuary converted into a development, his independence rewritten by paperwork, his history buried under HOA bylaws. Inside the cabin, he brushed dust from the kitchen table and unfolded old deed. The original homestead patent from 1923 bore federal seals and signatures from an era when men carved livelihoods from wilderness, not from legal loopholes. In its language lay a secret even he hadn't paid much attention to: mineral rights, water rights, and perpetual access easements extending far beyond the cabin's footprint. That first night back, Declan lit a kerosene lamp and sat at the table, reading by flickering light. Outside, the valley lay silent except for the distant hum of generators from the mansions below. He had come home to heal, but the documents in his hands whispered of a fight he hadn't planned to wage. Somewhere beyond the darkness, the HOA's queen was already plotting her next move. The chains across his driveway were only the beginning. As the lamp hissed softly and shadows stretched long across the log walls, Declan felt a surge of clarity. This was more than an argument about roof colors or mailbox designs. It was about power: who had it, who used it, and who was willing to stand up when it was misused. The valley had been waiting nearly a century for someone to defend it. By returning, he had unwittingly volunteered. The growl of engines climbed the gravel road like thunder rolling up from the valley floor. Outside the cabin window, 3 pairs of headlights swayed through the trees, growing brighter until they splashed across the cedar walls like stage lights on a set. Declan stood still, listening. The sound was not the familiar purr of pickup trucks belonging to locals. It was the low, expensive hum of luxury SUVs, the sort of vehicles that ferried consultants to boardrooms, not residents to mountain homes. The valley air, usually crisp with pine and cold creek water, now carried a sharp undertone of cologne and heated brake. He stepped onto the porch and watched the convoy stop at the chain driveway. The lead vehicle, a gleaming white Range Rover, rolled to a halt exactly where the new private community sign stood like a sentry. 2 other BMW SUVs pulled in behind it, their chrome grills glinting even in the muted mountain light. Doors opened. Designer boots hit gravel. Clipboards appeared like shields. The HOA had come to stake its claim. From the porch, Declan's view of the valley spread out below. 8 glass and steel mansions glimmered like alien ships against the muted tones of pine and rock. Once, this was a meadow filled with lupin and Indian paintbrush. Now, ornamental lawns and paved driveways dissected the land into geometric parcels, each one a testament to money and entitlement. The very sight hardened his resolve. He thought of his great-grandfather cutting this road by hand, his mother saving every dollar to keep the land taxes paid, and his own calloused years on oil rigs to cover her care. All of it now threatened by a clipboard army. Down below, the newcomers fanned out, cameras clicking. They photographed the cabin from every angle, zooming in on the old root cellar, the stacked firewood, even the rusted F-250 parked at the edge of the clearing. Their movements were efficient, practiced. A survey team collecting ammunition for the next round of paper warfare. The air vibrated with low murmurs and the faint mechanical whir of camera shutters. This was not a neighborly visit. It was an inspection disguised as authority. Inside the cabin, boxes of old documents lay open on the kitchen table. The original homestead patent, county maps, and tax receipts told a story the newcomers had not read. Mineral rights, water rights, perpetual access easements, words on parchment that outweighed any glossy violation notice. The deeper Declan looked, the clearer the pattern became. The HOA's rules had been filed only 18 months ago, long after his family had stopped selling parcels. His signature appeared nowhere in the covenant. Legally, the association's authority ended at the cabin's boundary. Yet here they were, acting as if he were just another homeowner under their jurisdiction. As afternoon shadows lengthened, the convoy departed, leaving behind a driveway littered with tire tracks and the faint scent of perfume. The next morning's mail confirmed what the inspection had meant. 14 separate violation notices, each stamped with official letterhead and written in an aggressive hand. Unpermitted structures, improper vehicle storage, non-compliant landscaping, unauthorized outdoor equipment, fines of $500 per day until corrected. The paper cuts on his fingers felt like tiny acts of revenge as he sorted through the stack. It was not just harassment, it was a strategy: suffocate the last holdout with bureaucracy until he sold. He remembered something his grandfather used to say on the mountain: bullies work in shadows. Drag them into daylight and they lose their teeth. If the HOA wanted to wage war by paperwork, he would fight with documentation of his own. The valley still had one Radio Shack left, a dusty relic in a strip mall where old technologies waited for people like him. That afternoon, he bought 6 trail cameras with night vision and audio recording. Colorado was a one-party consent state. Every word spoken on his property would now belong to him. By the second morning, the cameras had already paid off. Hidden along the tree-line, they captured Vivian Ashworth herself creeping onto his land at dawn with 2 committee members, snapping photographs and whispering about strategy. The audio was restaurant clear. "Stack as many violations as possible," she instructed. "The faster we pressure him, the faster he'll sell." Another committee member suggested claiming environmental contamination. Vivian's voice purred with approval. "Brilliant. I'll call County Health tomorrow." Emergency concerns always get immediate response. Their trespass was not just unethical, it was illegal. Evidence that could void any action they took based on those visits. Declan sat on the porch that evening, coffee steaming in the cool air, watching storm clouds gather over the valley. The cabins and mansions below seemed like pieces on a chessboard. Vivian moved by entitlement and emotion, counting on intimidation to drive him out. He moved by patience, planning 3 steps ahead. Years of working oil rigs had taught him how to think around lethal machinery. Years of caring for his mother had taught him endurance. Both skills were about to be tested. True to Vivian's promise, the next call came from the county health department, a surprise inspection of his septic system. He invited them up gladly, letting them test everything officially. When the inspector's readings came back cleaner than most new installations, he handed the man a USB drive loaded with trail camera footage of Vivian plotting false complaints. It was the first crack in her armor. In the valley below, storm clouds split open with rain, darkening the manicured lawns and glass walls of Pine Ridge Estates. From the cabin porch, the water ran off naturally, feeding wildflowers and old pine root. Nature had its own way of revealing what was real and what was fabricated. As the inspector's county truck disappeared down the mountain trail, Declan felt the first faint scent of incoming justice riding on the wet wind. But he also understood the fight had only begun. False environmental complaints were one thing. Coordinated harassment through multiple agencies was another. The HOA had money, lawyers, and friendly officials. He had evidence, patience, and the mineral rights hidden like buried gold under their mansions. The battle ahead would not be quick. It would be a war of attrition fought in courtrooms, county offices, and the court of public opinion. That night, kerosene light flickered across the log walls as Declan mapped out his next move. He marked each violation notice on a calendar, noting the dates and times of trespass caught on his cameras. He organized deeds, patents, and maps into labeled binders. In one corner of the kitchen lay a folder marked Strategy, a growing collection of knowledge nuggets about HOA law, mineral rights, and environmental regulations. Each fact was a tool, each tool a lever, and each lever a way to shift the balance of power back toward the truth. Outside, the rain turned to mist, softening the edges of the valley but not its reality. In the mansions below, lights glowed like citadels in the fog. Up on the ridge, the old cabin held steady, a fortress of history and quiet determination. For nearly a century it had weathered mountain storms. Now it would weather a different kind. By dawn the mist had lifted, revealing tire tracks where none should have been. Deep ruts in the mud snaked toward the tree-line, ending near a cluster of pines just beyond the camera's view. Someone had been on the property again, someone who knew where the cameras were and how to avoid them. The first round had been fought on paper. The next would not be so polite. Dawn cracked across the valley like a blade of pale gold, slicing through mist that clung low over the lawns and driveways of Pine Ridge Estates. From the cabin porch, the view was at once breathtaking and unsettling. Beauty had always been the valley's currency, but now that beauty felt stolen, packaged, and resold. The morning light revealed fresh tire ruts in the mud near the tree-lean, deep, purposeful tracks that curved just out of the camera's range. Whoever had been here last night had known exactly how to skirt his surveillance. This wasn't idle trespass anymore. It was reconnaissance. The old cabin, with its cedar walls and century-old stone foundation, felt like a war room. Inside, the kitchen table had become a map of the conflict. Binders of violation notices, stacks of photographs, county records, and a neat row of USB drives holding trail camera footage. The evidence grew daily, a quiet arsenal against the glossy paperwork barrage from Pine Ridge Estates. But the new tire tracks signaled a shift. Vivian Ashworth's campaign was evolving from bureaucratic siege to covert operations. The valley below was silent except for the distant hum of generators powering the mansion's climate systems. They stood like fortresses in the early light, their reflective windows hiding whatever conversations were taking place inside. He imagined strategy meetings over catered breakfasts, plans for the next wave of complaints, maybe even whispers about the trail camera footage he'd already begun sharing with county inspectors. For people used to operating in shadows, daylight exposure was lethal. They must have sensed it coming. 3 days after the septic inspection had backfired, a new barrage arrived. Certified letters from a downtown Denver law firm whose letterhead felt heavier than the paper it was printed on. 47 pages of legal jargon claimed he had caused irreparable harm to community property values and demanded $250,000 in damages and compliance fees. The subtext was clear: hire expensive lawyers or be steamrolled. But in their eagerness, they had overplayed their hand. The lawsuit claimed damages from months when he wasn't even in the state, a rookie mistake that would unravel under scrutiny. Declan read the document under the hiss of a kerosene lamp. Outside, night pressed against the cabin windows, but his mind was clear. Years on oil rigs had taught him that complex systems fail where they're weakest. Years caring for his mother had taught him patience. This fight would be a test of both. The next morning, he drove into town to the county library. The internet connection there was faster, and the smell of old paper and floor wax steadied his thoughts. He dug through public records of Pine Ridge Estates, shell company registrations, and building permit. The pattern emerged like a photograph in a darkroom. Shell corporations buying land, rushed permits through friendly officials, HOA formed with unilateral control, harassment of holdouts, forced sales below market value. Texas, Florida, Arizona, the same story repeated like a script. Vivian Ashworth wasn't just a petty tyrant with a clipboard. She was a career operator running a multi-state scheme. But she and her research team had missed one critical detail. While they focused on surface ownership and HOA covenants, they hadn't bothered to check the mineral rights history. The original 1923 homestead patent covered not just 320 acres but the entire valley floor and surrounding ridges, 1,280 acres of subsurface rights, water rights, and perpetual access easements. Under federal mining law, those rights often superseded local zoning and HOA restrictions. It meant that while they built mansions on the surface, he still owned the ground beneath their foundations. In effect, every house was sitting on his legal authority. Back at the cabin, he spread the documents across the table like a battle map. Each page was a weapon, each clause a pressure point. The fight was no longer about survival. It was about leverage. If Vivian Ashworth wanted to press him with fines and false complaints, he could press back with mineral rights, environmental violations, and federal law. Yet leverage without timing is just weight. He decided to let them keep digging their own grave. The trail cameras stayed active. Each trespass, each whispered conspiracy, each false report added another stone to the pile. When the time came, he would hand it all to someone who could act on it. In the meantime, the harassment escalated. Power outages struck the cabin without warning. Service crews arrived claiming dangerous electrical violations that required immediate disconnection. Certified letters arrived by courier demanding immediate payment. Anonymous tips flooded county offices alleging environmental contamination, structural instability, and public health hazard. The attacks were coordinated, relentless, and designed to break him. But each strike also exposed them. Power company records showed who had authorized disconnections. County call logs recorded the timing of anonymous tip. The pattern of false reports was a crime in itself. Harassment through government agencies, a tactic that federal prosecutors treated as serious business. With every attack, they were building his case for him. Evenings on the porch became his ritual. He would sit with coffee steaming in the cold air, watching the valley lights flicker below. The mansions glowed like trophies of a rigged game. But the mountains had their own memory, older than any HOA. Storm clouds built over the ridges, heavy with spring rain. Nature was preparing its own kind of reckoning. One night, as wind rattled the eaves, his cameras captured something new. 3 figures in dark clothing creeping around the property with gasoline cans, spray paint, and a bag of supplies. The smell of accelerant reached him before the sight. They were planning arson on a cabin built from fire-resistant cedar logs during Colorado's wet season, under surveillance from 6 night vision cameras. He stepped onto the porch with his grandfather's old lever-action rifle slung in plain sight, not pointed, just visible. The figures froze like deer, dropped their supplies, and ran for the road, stumbling into the dark. Left behind were a gasoline can, 3 spray paint cans, road flares, and what looked like a timing device. Evidence enough to upgrade harassment into felony charges. He called the sheriff directly. By the time patrol cars arrived, the evidence was bagged and photographed. The sheriff, a straight shooter disgusted by how his department had been used for false complaints, promised to elevate it to state investigators. Off the record, he mentioned the FBI had been asking questions about similar property fraud schemes. Apparently, someone at the federal level was already watching. Inside the cabin later that night, Declan sat at the kitchen table surrounded by evidence, the kerosene lamp casting long shadows across the walls. What had begun as a return home to heal had become a multi-front battle against a criminal enterprise. But the tide was turning. He wasn't the defendant in this story anymore. He was becoming the plaintiff, the man with enough documentation to dismantle their operation. Outside, the rain started again, tapping on the cedar roof like a countdown. The valley smelled of wet earth and pine sap, but also of something new, justice building like a storm. Down below, the mansions glimmered under the weight of secrets about to surface. Up on the ridge, the cabin held steady, a fortress of history and patience. The grizzly bear had been poked too many times. It was awake now. Morning sunlight spilled over the courthouse like a spotlight, glinting off windows still streaked with last night's rain. Down in the parking lot, a black SUV with government plates idled, its engine a quiet growl against the small-town hush. A woman in a dark suit stepped out, carrying a leather briefcase stamped with a federal seal. Her presence changed the air around the building. Suddenly, the long-running feud in Pine Ridge Valley was no longer a local oddity. It was a federal case. Inside, Declan sat at a corner table of the clerk's office, binders of evidence stacked like bricks at his elbow. His trail cameras had captured trespassing, conspiracy, and even attempted arson. County records documented false complaints, rushed permits, and a tangle of shell companies. Mineral rights deeds gave him leverage under federal law. For weeks he had been building this arsenal quietly. Now he was ready to hand it to someone who could use it. The woman introduced herself to the clerk and began leafing through the paperwork Declan had already filed. She didn't react outwardly, but the tiniest flicker of her eyes betrayed interest at each incriminating piece. False environmental reports. Trespass by HOA committee members. permits issued without required mineral rights notifications, coordinated harassment across multiple agencies. By the time she reached the arson evidence, her expression had shifted from professional neutrality to quiet intensity. This wasn't just a neighborhood dispute. It was organized fraud with federal hook. The next weeks moved like a thunderstorm building over the mountains. Behind the scenes, federal investigators began drawing lines between Pine Ridge estates and similar operations in Texas, Florida, and Arizona. Financial crimes specialists traced HOA fees disappearing into shell companies. Environmental attorneys flagged violations of federal clean water statute. Former FBI agents turned private investigators pieced together a pattern of harassment campaigns aimed at forcing out original residents. Each new discovery stacked atop Declan's evidence like stones in a cairn, pointing the way forward. On the surface, life at the cabin still followed the rhythms of the mountains. Mornings smelled of coffee and damp earth. Evenings glowed with kerosene light. But under that calm, a network was forming. Lawyers who specialized in property rights volunteered their time. Neighbors came forward with their own documentation of intimidation. County officials, embarrassed by how their offices had been used, quietly passed along internal emails. The more Vivian Ashworth tried to tighten her grip, the more people slipped through her fingers. She didn't stop pressing, of course. Power cutoffs, certified letters, anonymous tips. Her tactics escalated as the walls closed in. But each move added another breadcrumb to the trail leading back to her. Federal prosecutors loved trails like that. By early summer, an emergency injunction had frozen all HOA enforcement activities in Pine Ridge estates pending investigation. Homeowners who had once feared speaking out began contacting Declan directly, sharing stories of illegal assessments and threats of foreclosure. For the first time in years, the balance of power in the valley shifted. One evening, as thunder rolled across the ridges, Declan sat on his porch watching mist coil through the pines. Below, the mansions glimmered in the fading light like a row of glass chess pieces about to be swept from the board. He thought about his great-grandfather carving this road by hand, about his mother's quiet dignity in her final years, about the decades of labor that had paid for this land again and again. He hadn't planned to become the point man in a federal investigation. But sometimes mountains pick their defenders. The federal team moved methodically. Financial subpoenas went out. Permit files were seized. Witness interviews were scheduled. Each new action sent tremors through Pine Ridge Estate. Vivian Ashworth's once unshakable facade began to crack. She called press conferences to paint herself as a persecuted community builder. She filed frantic lawsuits full of conspiracy theories about federal overreach and environmental terrorism. She hired private security firms to protect her constitutional rights, which in reality meant surveillance and intimidation that skirted legality. But federal agents were patient, letting her desperation accumulate like evidence in a vault. By late summer, the picture was clear. A decade-long pattern of shell companies, bribed officials, fraudulent permits, weaponized HOAs, forced sales, and embezzled fees totaling millions. The cabins and mansions of Pine Ridge Valley weren't just scenery anymore. They were exhibits in the largest homeowners association fraud case in the country. And at the center of it all was a platinum blonde woman who had underestimated the quiet man on the ridge. Declan's role shifted from target to witness, then from witness to plaintiff. With attorneys coordinating civil suits alongside the federal criminal case, he now had the leverage to demand restitution for victims, environmental remediation for the valley, and permanent conservation protections for the land. The old cabin, once besieged by violation notices, became the staging ground for justice. On a crisp September morning, helicopters thundered over the mountains, their rotor wash scattering pine needles like confetti. Federal agents in windbreakers swarmed the mansions below, seizing records and computers. County trucks pulled up to haul away boxes of evidence. News vans crowded the roads, cameras pointed toward the spectacle. Text messages from neighbors pinged Declan's phone. "What did you do? FBI just arrested Viv. They're calling it the biggest HOA fraud case in Colorado history. From the porch, he watched the valley transform into a crime scene. After months of harassment, isolation, and quiet preparation, justice had arrived like a storm. The mountain air smelled different again, cleaner, sharper, threaded with pine and the metallic tang of rotor wash. For the first time in years, he felt the valley exhale. Morning broke over Pine Ridge Valley under a sky scrubbed clean by the previous day's helicopter downdraft. The air smelled of damp pine and ozone, as if the mountains themselves had been washed. Down below, the 8 glass and steel mansions no longer glimmered like trophies. They sat mute and sealed, evidence tags fluttering on their gates. Federal seals covered front doors. Couriers carried out boxes of seized documents. News vans idled at the road's edge, satellite dishes angled skyward like metallic sunflowers. Declan stood on the porch of the old cabin, coffee warming his hands, and watched the scene with a quiet, almost surreal detachment. Months of surveillance, paperwork, and harassment had boiled down to this: a valley turned into a courtroom. He had been the invisible man on the ridge for so long. Now journalists were calling him a whistleblower. Headlines screamed about the largest HOA fraud case in state history, but to him it was still about the simple right to sit on his porch without a clipboard army marching up his driveway. Yet even as agents swarmed and cameras rolled, he felt a subtle unease. Vivian Ashworth hadn't been led away in handcuffs with the others. The FBI had seized her properties, frozen accounts, and served warrants, but no one knew exactly where she was. Some said she'd slipped out the night before. Others whispered about offshore bank accounts and private planes. The woman who had orchestrated the harassment of Pine Ridge Valley wasn't finished. She was regrouping. Inside the cabin, the kitchen table was strangely bare. The binders of evidence were gone, turned over to federal prosecutors. The walls, once lined with documents and maps, now felt empty. For the first time in months, the cabin no longer resembled a war room. It felt like what it was meant to be, a home. But in the emptiness there was also vulnerability. Without his own copies of evidence, without the constant focus of fighting, he felt the void where adrenaline had been. He spent the next days walking the property lines, reacquainting himself with the land beyond legal boundaries. Autumn sunlight slanted through the pines, gilding patches of wildflowers that had survived beneath the manicured lawns. The old creek still gurgled through its stone bed, unbothered by human schemes. The mountains held their secrets and their patience. In that quiet, he began to understand that winning the legal battle was only part of reclaiming the valley. The other part was stitching its torn fabric back together. But the fight wasn't over. Strange things began to happen at night again. Drones buzzing just above tree level, motion lights flicking on without reason, footprints in the soft earth near the treeline. Whoever was behind it knew the cameras were gone. He had left them with the feds, thinking the worst was past. Now, without surveillance, the valley felt exposed. He installed new cameras from a small-town hardware store, cheaper, less sophisticated, but better than nothing. He reinforced the cabin doors and stored digital copies of key documents in a hidden safe. The legal war might have shifted to courtrooms in Denver, but the ground war in Pine Ridge was still being fought in the shadows. The nights grew longer and colder. Without the constant glow of the mansions below, their windows now dark under federal seizure, the valley returned to the deep, star-filled blackness he remembered from childhood. But the silence had an edge. Footsteps in the gravel one night. A red laser dot skittering across the cabin door another. Whoever was left from Vivian's circle wanted to remind him he wasn't untouchable. He documented every incident, photographing footprints, saving drone footage to a new encrypted drive, and reporting each event to the federal agent he'd come to trust. It was like stacking kindling for a fire that would burn in court later. Yet a part of him wondered what Vivian's endgame really was. She had lost her money, her properties, and her legal cover. All she had left was desperation. One crisp morning, A letter arrived without a return address. No threats, no fines, no legalese. Just a single photograph of the cabin taken from the ridge at night, the windows glowing like targets. On the back, 3 words in thick black ink: "This isn't over." He turned it over in his hands, the paper trembling slightly. It wasn't fear so much as recognition. The war wasn't finished, it was just entering its next phase. In response, he began to shift from defense to offense. Through the lawyers now handling the civil suits, he filed motions to convert the temporary injunction into a permanent one. He petitioned for full conservation status for the valley under federal easement, using the mineral rights as leverage. He worked with state wildlife officials to document endangered species on the property, creating another legal barrier to future development. Every move was a brick in a wall meant to outlast both him and Vivian. Weeks passed. Snow dusted the peak. Federal prosecutors began indicting lower-level operatives from the HOA scheme, one by one, flipping them for testimony. Each guilty plea pulled another thread from Vivian's web. Media attention shifted from local dispute to national scandal. In Denver, the first hearings were scheduled. In Pine Ridge, the old cabin stood like a lighthouse in the winter twilight. But in the shadows of that new prominence came risk. One night a pickup without plates roared up the gravel road, braked hard at the chain driveway, and spun away again, spraying rocks like shrapnel. Another time, a stranger with a camera drone camped on the public road for hours, trying to provoke a reaction. Declan refused to be baited. He kept the porch lights on, the cameras rolling, and his lawyer on speed dial. By December, the valley looked transformed. The manicured lawns of the mansions had gone wild under neglect, creeping back toward meadow. Pine saplings sprouted in cracks of decorative pavement. The creek cut its natural course again where someone had tried to straighten it. Slowly, the land was reclaiming itself, as if erasing the development 1 inch at a time. Watching it, Declan felt a surge of resolve. Vivian might still be out there, but the valley was no longer hers. Piece by piece, it was becoming whole again. January rolled in cold and heavy, a sky the color of old steel pressing low over Pine Ridge Valley. Snow crusted the gravel road leading up to the cabin, muffling footsteps and softening the scars left by months of conflict. But the fight was about to move from frozen ground to polished marble floors. The county sheriff's call confirmed what Declan had sensed for weeks. Vivian Ashworth had resurfaced, armed with a new legal team and a fresh strategy. She was petitioning for emergency access to the valley, claiming deprivation of property and community right. It was a last-ditch effort to claw back control. Denver's federal courthouse stood like a granite fortress downtown, its columns pale against the winter sky. Inside, high ceilings and echoing corridors magnified every sound: the squeak of shoes on marble, the shuffle of paper, the muted hum of reporters gathering outside the courtroom. Declan entered quietly, carrying only a small briefcase. His lawyers handled the bulk of the work now, but he had insisted on being present. This wasn't just a case number. It was his family's land, his mother's memory, and his own hard years condensed into a single fight. On the opposite side of the courtroom sat Vivian Ashworth. The platinum bob was intact but dulled, the designer suit more defensive than commanding. Her new attorneys fanned out around her like a protective phalanx. They argued in rapid bursts of legal jargon, painting her as a community builder wronged by a rogue landowner. But the mountain of evidence collected over months — trespass, false complaints, attempted arson, shell company fraud — rose higher than their rhetoric. Federal prosecutors methodically laid it out like a brick wall, each exhibit another stone blocking her escape. Declan's attorneys countered her emergency access petition by unveiling the mineral rights documents in open court. Maps showed not just surface ownership but the vast subsurface rights extending under every mansion in Pine Ridge Estate. Legal precedent after precedent established that the homestead patents rights superseded later covenant. To the judge, it wasn't a community dispute anymore. It was a case of systemic fraud built on ignoring a century-old deed. Outside, cameras flashed. Reporters speculated about a land rights showdown and a battle for the valley. Inside, the proceedings moved with glacial steadiness. Each witness called by the prosecution added another layer. A county inspector who admitted being pressured to file false reports. A former HOA committee member flipping for immunity, describing Vivian's tactics in detail. A banking analyst tracing stolen HOA fees to offshore accounts. Piece by piece, the image sharpened of a long-running scheme that had finally met a wall it couldn't breach. During recess, Declan stood by a courthouse window looking out at the snow swirling between skyscrapers. He thought about the cabin high on the ridge, the creek running beneath ice, the saplings pushing through neglected lawns. All of it felt far away and yet present, as if the mountains had extended their patience into these halls. He hadn't asked to be here. He had simply come home and refused to leave. But that refusal had triggered a reckoning bigger than himself. By late afternoon, the judge denied Vivian's emergency petition, citing overwhelming evidence of misconduct. Federal prosecutors announced additional indictments under the RICO statute, transforming the case from property fraud into organized crime. Her new legal team's arguments collapsed under the weight of facts. For the first time, Vivian's composure cracked. Cameras captured the moment. The image would headline the evening news. HOA Queen's empire crumbles in court. But Declan knew better than to celebrate early. Complex cases took months or years to resolve. Appeals could drag on. Vivian still had resources, contacts, and spite. Yet the momentum had shifted irreversibly. With each ruling, each indictment, the valley's future moved a little further out of her reach. Back on the mountain, snow fell thicker, blanketing the valley in white silence. The seized mansions sat dark and heavy, their lawns hidden under drifts. The creek burrowed beneath ice, unseen but still flowing. In the cabin, kerosene light flickered across bare walls. The war room had become a sanctuary again, but its keeper had changed. He was no longer a lone man fending off clipboards. He was the witness at the center of a federal case, the lever that had shifted a system. Evenings he walked the property lines, snow crunching under boots, breath rising in white plumes. The mountains stood indifferent but steady, their granite shoulders bearing witness to yet another human drama. As he traced the old boundary stakes, he imagined the day when the valley would be formally protected. No more chains across driveways, no more violation notices, no more shadows lurking at night. Just land and sky and the slow, stubborn return of wildflowers. March storms rolled down from the high peaks like avalanches of wind and ice, rattling the valley's bare branches and drumming sleet against the cabin's cedar walls. From his porch, Declan stared at the single light burning inside one of the seized mansions below. For weeks they had all been dark, locked under federal seal. Now, in the teeth of a blizzard, one glowed like an eye opening in the dark. The snow muffled sound but not instinct. Every nerve in his body told him someone was back. He checked the date stamped on his mental calendar. The hearing had been only 2 days ago. Vivian had lost her emergency petition and left the courthouse under a crush of cameras. She hadn't been remanded to custody. She was still technically free on bond. And she had always been boldest when cornered. He shut off the porch light and let his eyes adjust. The glow inside the mansion flickered irregularly, not the steady beam of security lights but the bobbing, shadow-thrown gleam of flashlights or candles. Movement crossed the windows, a figure with a platinum blonde bob. Even at this distance, under sleet and darkness, he felt the recognition like a jolt. Vivian Ashworth had returned to her fortress. The valley around her had changed. Lawns once manicured to perfection now lay buried under snow and creeping wild grass. Driveways cracked. Frozen fountains stood like gravestones. The empire she had built was dissolving even as she tried to reoccupy it. But desperation was dangerous. He knew enough about cornered predators to expect a final strike. Inside the cabin, he kept no more evidence. Everything had gone to the feds. but he still had the habit of documentation. He snapped photos of the glowing window with a telephoto lens and texted them to his contact at the federal office. No reply. Storms had knocked out cell towers before. Tonight the valley might be cut off again. He was alone on the ridge with a woman who had already tried to burn him out. Hours passed. The light in the mansion moved from room to room, like someone gathering or destroying records. Occasionally it paused at a window, scanning the slopes below. Declan stayed still, a silhouette behind his own darkened glass, as sleet hammered the cabin roof. He thought about his great-grandfather out here in the 1920s, surviving blizzards with nothing but wood heat and grit. He thought about his mother fighting through slow illness. He thought about all the quiet patience the land had taught him. Tonight would demand the same. Just before midnight, a second vehicle appeared, a black pickup creeping up the main road with its lights off. It pulled behind the mansion. The storm hid the sound but not the shape of men unloading equipment. Long cases. Cans of accelerant. Something metallic glinting under a tarp. This was no ordinary trespass. It was a last-ditch act to erase or retake the valley by force. Declan moved methodically. He didn't charge down the hill. He didn't switch on lights. He opened his hidden safe and retrieved the digital copies of his mineral rights deeds and photograph. He backed up his phone to a hard drive, sealed it in a waterproof pouch, and placed it in the root cellar. Then he activated the cheap new trail cameras he'd mounted days earlier. Their red LEDs winked on like tiny eyes in the storm, catching shapes in the darkness. Down below, the figures moved toward the creek, the natural line that still marked access to the cabin. They planted something in the snow, stakes or charges. He couldn't tell which. The storm howled louder, covering their voices. Whatever they were planning, it would be imminent. From his porch, he raised a flare gun and fired a single crimson streak into the sky. It arced above the valley, casting blood-red light over the snow and glass mansions. For a moment the scene looked like a battlefield frozen in time. Wild meadow under snow, abandoned trophies of greed, and desperate figures caught red-handed in the flare's glow. Cameras hidden along the tree line recorded everything. A mile away, in town, a sheriff's deputy saw the flare. 20 minutes later, the faint wail of sirens began to echo through the storm, growing closer, swallowed and released by the canyons. Below, the figures scrambled, trying to drag equipment back to the pickup. Vivian's blonde hair flashed once in the flare-light as she turned toward the ridge, realizing too late that the quiet man in the cabin had set a trap. Declan stayed still until the convoy of law enforcement vehicles crested the hill. Blue lights cut through sleet like electric spears. Officers fanned out, weapons drawn but voices steady. They moved with the practiced choreography of people who had been briefed. Within minutes, the black pickup was boxed in. Figures were cuffed and led away under gusts of snow. Evidence cases were photographed, tagged, and sealed. He watched from the porch as they brought Vivian out last. The platinum bob sagged wet under sleet, her designer boots sinking into snow. Even at a distance he could see the shift in her posture. Not defiance now. Not even fury. Just the stunned weight of a plan gone wrong. Headlights reflected off handcuffs as she was guided into the back of a sheriff's SUV. The Empire had returned to the valley, but not in the way she had planned. The storm blew for hours after the vehicles disappeared. Snow filled the footprints, erased tire tracks, and softened the outlines of the seized mansions. By dawn, the valley looked untouched, as if the night had been a dream. But the digital cameras held the truth, and so did the federal agents who now had Vivian in custody. For the first time since coming home, Declan felt a deep, unbroken silence settle over the ridge. Not the tense silence of waiting, but the real silence of a place exhaling after a long fight. He stood at the porch rail, snow soaking his flannel sleeves, and watched the sky pale over the peaks. The mountains had been patient. The land had been patient. He had been patient. Now all of them had outlasted her. Spring arrived in Pine Ridge Valley like a long exhale after years of held breath. Snowmelt cascaded down the slopes, swelling the creek until it sang against its stone bed. Meadows once carved into ornamental lawns erupted with wildflowers, lupin, paintbrush, and columbine reclaiming space as if they had been waiting just beyond the frost. The mansions below, stripped of their gloss, sat quiet and empty, glass shells reflecting the riot of color they had tried to suppress. From the cabin porch, Declan watched it unfold with a patience that matched the land's. His great-grandfather's road, cut by hand nearly a century ago, was now lined with shoots of green breaking through gravel. The cedar walls of the cabin glowed in morning light, weathered but unbowed. For the first time since his return, the valley looked more alive than wounded. News from Denver arrived in steady waves. Vivian Ashworth faced a list of charges long enough to fill entire columns in the papers. Fraud, conspiracy, bribery, attempted arson, racketeering. Her empire of shell companies collapsed under subpoenas. Associates flipped, revealing a national network of property scams. For years she had forced out families across the country, flipping valleys and ridges into playgrounds for the rich. Now, under the weight of federal indictments, her reach had ended here, on the slope of a mountain where one family refused to move. The county courthouse, once complicit, now issued rulings in Declan's favor. The mineral rights deed, once a dusty relic, became the bedrock of new protections. State conservation officials filed paperwork designating Pine Ridge Valley as a protected habitat, its water and mineral rights shielded from future development. What had begun as a desperate defense of one cabin was ending as a guarantee for generations. Yet the valley still bore scars. Roads carved for SUVs cut through meadows. Stone gates stood abandoned, their iron bars rusting under spring rain. Empty swimming pools yawned like wounds in the ground. Declan spent his days walking the perimeter, sketching a plan to let nature reclaim what it could. Saplings were already sprouting through cracks in pavement. The creek, freed from false channels, began restoring its meander. Left alone, the land had a way of healing itself faster than people expected. Letters arrived daily, from journalists wanting interviews, from lawyers handling settlements, from strangers thanking him for standing up when others couldn't. He answered few of them. Fame was for people chasing spotlights. He had only wanted peace. What mattered more were the quiet notes from neighbors who had once feared Vivian's wrath. "Thank you for not giving up. We have our homes back. You made it safe for us to speak." Those words carried more weight than headlines ever could. By midsummer, the mansions had been auctioned by the federal government. None sold quickly. Their size and stigma made them unattractive. Some stood empty still, their windows glinting like tired eyes. Others were bought by nonprofits or conservation groups, promising to dismantle or repurpose them. Slowly, the valley shifted from private kingdom to shared ground. One evening in July, Declan sat on the porch as the sky turned gold behind the peak. The air smelled of wild mint and pine sap. Below, the creek caught the last light like a ribbon of fire. He thought about the long arc of the valley's story, carved from wilderness by his great-grandfather's hands, defended by his mother's sacrifices, nearly stolen by greed, then pulled back from the edge by patience and persistence. He thought about the flare arcing over the storm that night, the sirens cutting through sleet, the moment the mountains themselves seemed to lean in and bear witness. He understood something then: the valley was never really his. He was only a caretaker, one in a long line of people who had lived and died under these peaks. The land had its own memory, its own stubborn will. All he had done was stand long enough for it to reveal itself again. As dusk deepened, coyotes called from the ridges. Fireflies blinked in the meadow. The cabin windows glowed warm behind him, not as targets this time, but as symbols of survival. He set his coffee mug on the rail and breathed in the night air. For the first time since returning, he felt not embattled but at home. Down in town, people would talk about the scandal for years. They would tell stories of the HOA queen who overreached, of the man who owned the whole valley, of the raid that turned luxury mansions into evidence lockers. But up on the ridge, where wind combed through pine and wildflowers leaned toward starlight, the story was simpler. The land had endured. And so had he.